welcome to my YouTube series that I like to call A Brief History of Female Artists. So in this series I like to talk about female artists all throughout art history that have been influential into art itself. And today I want to talk about artist Ana Mendieta. So Ana Mendieta was a Cuban body artist that was born in 1948. So to give a little bit of background to performance art, it was an art form that was kind of born through performance art and was kind of created in the 1970s. The characteristics is the use of one's body in the art piece, whether that be video, photography, or performance. Body art also stemmed from the rejection of abstract expressionism, which was kind of the art form that was in style. But this kind of art form was mostly led by male artists, and this type of art style also didn't really talk about politics or anything like that. So the political landscape in America during this time was electrified with ideas of human rights, and feminism was on a new high. It was like the second wave of feminism. And the female body was heavily discussed, and many female artists wanted to kind of liberate themselves from this kind of patriarchal view of the female body. Women have often been the victims of objectification by male artists. And the creation of body art let female artists create their own discord about their own bodies. So yeah, now you kind of have like a little background of what body art meant and what it was. So yeah, Ana Mendieta was born in Cuba in 1948, 11 years after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And so she and her sister was sent to America in 1961 as a result. So she was part of a project that sent Cuban children away to escape the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. So Ana Mendieta and her sister, they kind of only had each other when they came to America. Like, they only had each other to rely on to kind of deal with the trauma of being ripped away from their whole family. And, you know, they were kind of struggling being in these like new surroundings. They were reunited with their mother and their brother in 1966, and they were also reunited with their father in 1979 after he had spent nearly 2 decades in a political prison in Cuba. So Ana Mendieta had always had an interest in art, and she started to study it after she was done with high school. So her professor actually introduced her to the growing art scene of performance art, and Mendieta began to experiment with using her own body and her own blood in her art pieces. She wanted to portray themes of gender fluidity in her art, as well as cultural oppression and domestic violence. So Ana Mendieta entered a decade-long affair with her professor, even though he was 13 years older than her. He was actually a huge influence on her and her art. She was featured in his own art pieces, La Ventosa from 1971 being one example. He also introduced her to different kinds of artists, such as Vito Acconci and Hans Hacke, who would also further influence her art. Also, sorry if I mispronounced those names. So in 1971, Ana Mendieta traveled to Mexico to do further research for her art. She struggled with painful memories, you know, from fleeing from Cuba and the displacement she had felt ever since, and she would later refer to this trip as going back to the source. She decided to carry out a dialogue between the landscape and the female body. So the next artwork made by Ana Mendieta I want to talk about actually talks about sexual violence. So if you're not cool about hearing about those subjects, skip ahead. So in 1973, a fellow student at the college Mendieta attended was violently raped and murdered. Mendieta brought attention to this crime by creating her art piece titled Rape Scene. So in this art piece, Mendieta covered herself with cow's blood, and then she tied herself to the table in her apartment and invited her fellow students and teachers to stumble upon the scene. This piece is obviously very graphic. It was a performance piece, but there are photographs taken from the performance, and I'm actually not sure if I can show those to you, as in my opinion is quite graphic, but I will put a link in the description to the photograph that I'm talking about. So the next year, Mendieta returned to Mexico, and this is where she starts creating her Silueta Series, which is actually, I think, what she's most famous for. So the first piece of this series is called Imagen de Yagul. Again, really sorry if I'm mispronouncing those words. Which is a photograph depicting Mendieta lying down in an open Zapotec tomb. Her naked body is covered in flowers and grass. She talks about Mexican culture and their beliefs of death, as well as her own connections to the land and the earth, as she's literally becoming a part of the earth in this piece. Other photographs from her Silueta series shows traces of her body in forms of silhouettes that she either painted into the ground or carved out of the ground, and they kind of talk about this emptiness, that she always felt all throughout her life. She's talking about being exiled, as she was from her home country, and she's also talking about loss and erasure. Growing up as a Latina woman in the US, she was under a lot of pressure to kind of conform to the Western, the American kind of beauty standards, which was, fair, pale, and she felt like she had to hide her cultural heritage. So the silhouette that she presents in some of these photographs kind of shows her body being erased, like it doesn't exist anymore. There's just like an empty space of where she would be, which is, kind of how she felt. Another piece from this series shows her silhouette painted into the sand of a beach in Mexico. The silhouette is filled with red tempera, which kind of makes it seem like it's filled with blood. And the waves from the ocean come crashing in. They slowly erase the silhouette until there's nothing left anymore. So this piece talks about death and kind of the cycle of life, about how the body is slowly being returned to the earth. So Ana Mendieta brought up her cultural roots in many different forms in a video piece called Untitled Body Tracks from 1982, was a recorded performance piece where she placed a paper on the wall. Mendieta then entered, and she places her hands in a bowl that's filled with animal blood and red tempera. She then puts her hands on the paper, slowly drags it down towards the floor, creating red blood tracks across the paper. She uses the performance to highlight what she's doing and how she's doing it, as a photograph would not have had the same impact. We can see how slowly she is dragging her hands across the paper, and how the paper is being ripped by the bloody tracks that her hands are leaving on the paper just deteriorating more and more as she keeps, running her hands over it. In the background, Cuban music is being played, so we can conclude Mendieta is again talking about her heritage, and as well as trauma by the use of blood in this piece. So shortly after she is done with her university degree, she moves to New York, and as she's here, she meets a lot of feminist artists and becomes friends with a lot of them. She also meets her future husband, Carl Andre, who was a minimalist sculptor. In 1985, Ana Mendieta tragically passed away as she fell from the window in her Manhattan apartment. The accident took place after a heated argument with her husband, who was actually later charged with her murder. So even though neighbors testified that they had heard a woman screaming no, and Andre was found with scratches all over his face, he was still acquitted after a trial in front of a jury. So Mendieta's artworks were actually used as proof to back up the claim that she had committed suicide, even though all of her friends had said that she had no suicidal tendencies, and they also said that her artwork was about life and power and energy and not about death. And after the trial and after Andre was acquitted with murder, there was a lot of protests, and the art world was kind of divided because some people thought that the patriarchal structures just let another murderer go free, and some other people claimed that he was innocent. The tragedy of Mendieta's deaths just kind of makes her artwork all that more impactful. They kind of leave us with an eerie sense of ourselves and Earth and kind of the cycle of life and death. But yeah, so between the years 1972 and 1985, Mendieta created hundreds of photographs as well as several performances, sculptures, paintings, and drawings, and she's celebrated not only as a female artist but also as a Latina artist who frequently featured her cultural roots in her artwork. So yeah, that is a brief history of Ana Mendieta, and I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again next time. Bye!